Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how I did this dog's ear in pastels. Now this is a full-length tutorial that is available over on Patreon, but I thought for this I would just make a time-lapse video on how I did all the detailing or the layering process of Jake's ear. Now if you've seen any of my videos here on YouTube before, you'll know that my preferred method of getting my base layers down is using sanded soft pastel sticks and then applying that pigment to my paper with my soft tools. Now the shaped soft tool that I'm using here is the oval, and it is certainly my favourite. I've tried the triangular one, but I find that the sponge shifts and I'm not able to get as softer, smoother lines, so this is certainly my favourite. Now when I'm applying the base layer like what I'm doing here, all I'm trying to focus on is where I'm putting my lights and my darks. I'm not overly focused on the exact colour, I'm just going for close. If I see that it's a browner, yellower, yellow ochre, burnt sienna type colour, that is the type of colour that I'm going to select, but it really doesn't have to be the exact colour at this stage. So my main aim at this stage is just to block in where my lights and my darks are. Now if you have watched my videos here on YouTube, you'll know that I personally think that the base layers are really important. They are our foundation for our detailed layers, so I personally take a little bit extra time to make sure that I get them as accurate as I can. So you'll notice that I'm not making all of my base layers one solid colour. I'm really studying that reference photo to see where I need to put my specific elements of this ear. So at the moment here I'm mixing some of those redder magenta tones to get that red, the darkest effect in the middle of the ear. Now when we are focusing on dog ears, obviously this is going to vary depending on the breed that you're drawing, but if you've got a breed such as a corgi like Jake here, where the ear is sat upright, you are wanting to create that concaved effect where you've got that darker section in the middle and then it does taper off to be a lighter colour either side, and then you've got that colour of that fur on the edge. So that is what I'm trying to replicate when I'm doing my base layer stages. Now when we're drawing dog ears like this, as I say, it's really important to try and capture that shape of that ear. We want to give the illusion that that darker section in the middle is furthest away from the viewer, and then the ear, as it starts to curve towards us and capture that shape, that we want to make sure that we get that in our portrait. Now that is all mainly due to your lighting, making sure you get that middle section as dark as it needs to be, and then as I mentioned, fading out up to a lighter colour on the edges. Now obviously the lighting is going to vary depending on your light source, but for Jake's portrait here, and I've got a finished example of my artwork there in the corner, you can see just how dark I build up on my layers to get that real contrast in this ear. Now as always, I do like to add a layer of refinement on top of my base layers. This is just my personal preference and it's how I've always worked when using pastels. It only takes a few extra minutes to add this, but it really does make all the difference to your details. Now this is something that I talk a lot about in every single tutorial that I upload to Patreon. It is all in depth, considerably slower. Most of it is in fairly real time, hardly sped up at all, so I can speak you through all of this process and the colours that I'm selecting. But all I'm wanting to do is just add an extra layer of pastel on top of my base layers to try and fill that tooth, but it has to be filled slowly. Now it's one of the most common questions that I'm asked is why don't my details show up on top of my base layers? Now the most common reason for that is that you have accidentally filled the tooth of that paper too soon, and when you go and apply those detailed layers on top with your pastel pencils, it almost feels like they're gliding over and no pastel pigment is able to come out of that pencil. Now of course this is going to vary depending on the paper that you are using, and my personal preference is to use Pastelmat. Now I haven't ever got to the point where I filled the tooth of the paper, but it's quite hard to do that with Pastelmat. But if you do that, I am a strong believer that we learn from every single piece of art that we do, even if we make a mistake. Now filling the tooth of the paper is something that can happen quite easily. I have experimented with a couple of pan pastels and I can certainly see the common issue there where people have saying that they filled the tooth of the paper when they're using them. Now my personal preference when I'm using the pan pastels is actually to pick up some of that pigment and then mix that on a little bit of tracing paper to try and take off that excess pigment. I then apply that soft tool with that pan pastel to my Pastelmat paper. Now I'm not sure if it's due to the difference in the pigment and the texture of that pigment, but the sanded soft pastel sticks I find is less difficult to fill the tooth of the paper compared to when I've used the pan pastels. But if you do have that issue where you filled the tooth of the paper, I personally would be using a workable fixative to apply tooth back to that paper. As I say, I do think that we learn from these kinds of mistakes, and it therefore is giving you more information to apply that to your next pet portrait. Now, the one thing to be cautious of when you're using fixatives is it can shift the colour and the tones of your artwork. Now, if you are not finished and it's just to apply more tooth to that paper, it really doesn't matter, but that is certainly something to bear in mind. Now, here at the moment, my hands are moving about and I'm showing the pencils that I'm using, moving my finger here. This is because this whole section now is a real-time live voiceover which I uploaded to Patreon. So this was a individual 45-minute clip where I'm showing how I'm doing the detailed layers as I'm drawing them. So if that is of interest, my Patreon link is in the description below. And I'll also link my website, which has my Patreon library listing every single tutorial that I've got available on Patreon up to now. Now, this portrait of Jake was 16 by 24 inches, so it was quite big. So this took me many days. I mean, it was probably 7 days almost, just maybe over a week that I spent on this solid. So that's quite a lot of hours to fit into a tutorial. So what I've decided to do is split this up into two parts. The first part is just over 4 hours long, and that is uploaded to Patreon this weekend. So that is available over there now. And then the second part is going to be uploaded next week, so that the full tutorial will still be available in July. It's just going to be in 2 more manageable sections. The reference photo and the line art will be available over on Patreon as well, should you want to draw along to the tutorial and draw your own version of Jake. So when it comes to building up the layers here, when we're starting to add the detail on the ear, what you want to be focusing on is the fur that's closest to the skin. We want to be avoiding and trying to ignore all that detail that we can see at the very top. We need to save those layers till the very end. Now, if you have seen some of my other videos, you know that I do like to work in smaller sections. I personally feel that I'm able to work more effectively, and I do certainly get much more drawing done far more quicker. That's just my personal preference, but if you are someone who likes to work in complete set layers, that is absolutely fine to do that. This is just my personal preference. I like to see the portrait coming together and looking like that photograph rather than staying at the ugly stage for too long. Now, every portrait goes through the ugly stage. That is totally normal. It's all about building the base layers. If it didn't go through that ugly stage, we wouldn't be able to get as much depth in the portrait. So every single portrait has to go through it. It's something that shouldn't be disheartening, because we are never finished when we're at that base layer stage. If you look at your portrait and you find that it's something that's maybe you feel like you could do better, or it's not quite how you want, when you're working with pastels on Pastelmat paper especially, you can always add more layers, as I say, providing you've not filled the tooth of the paper. So if ever you do have that feeling that it's not as good as you might have hoped, or that it's just not looking how you wanted, it is just that it's not finished. Work on it, spend another hour or two, and that extra hour can make all the difference from taking it to the next level. Now, in the full-length tutorial on Patreon, I do explain why I'm selecting the specific colours at that time of using them, but you'll sometimes notice that some of the layers that I do are not actually that noticeable. Now, that is deliberate, because the more layers that we add, even if they are subtle, the more depth in the long run we will be able to create. So even if it appears like it's a bit of a wasted layer, there isn't really a such thing as a wasted layer, which is why if we accidentally make a mistake, as long as we're able to cover it over, it will actually add more depth, even if that was not what was intended. Now, when you're working on ear like this, and this would be the same principle for a cat ear as well, because they're very similar in this shape, it has to all be mainly focused on your contrast. If you don't get the middle section of the ear dark enough, you will not be able to have these details that need to overlap this area show up as much as they should. Now, this is something that I do change in this video. When I come to be working on that middle section, you'll see that I do end up having to make it quite a bit darker than what it is at the moment. That is absolutely fine as long as we notice these changes at the time. Now, if you do finish your portrait and you find that you need a little bit more contrast, you can obviously tweak these things, but it is better and easier for us in the long run if we make these changes at that time. Now the reason why I say that is it's better to make those differences and those changes in the contrast at the time, because you can end up having to blend out some of those details in order to get your base layers darker. You may be less likely to want to make those changes if the portrait was finished because of all the hours and all those days that we've put into it. So it's best to make these changes at that time. Now, lighting and your highlights and your shadows is something that I talk about a lot in every single tutorial. The contrast is the thing that's so important. I spend more time focusing on that more than worrying about the exact colour. Now the reason for that is this dog could have been taken in slightly different light even 5-10 minutes later and the colour would be slightly different. I was provided with maybe 15-20 photos of Jake, and every single photo he was a slightly different colour in each. So we want to make sure we go for close, of course we do, but we don't want to be focusing on colour so much that we forget about the contrast, because that is also really important. Now what I was showing you there is, as I mentioned, that was all really sped up, but this on Patreon is explained, and it's about focusing on a smaller area at one time. If you're finding that you're getting a bit overwhelmed, because as I say, if you are working larger and this was a big portrait, it can really help to focus your eye on a smaller area, work on a small couple of inch square at one time, and then move on to the next. So if you want to work that way, all I would recommend doing is printing out a small bit of paper, cut a small square out of it, put that over your reference photo and say to yourself, this is the only area of this portrait that I'm going to focus on at this time. By breaking it down like that, you will find that you will be able to tackle that portrait a lot more quickly and it will become less daunting. Now going back to the contrast, the one thing that is a useful tip is if you take a photograph of your artwork and you turn it into black and white, and you also turn your reference photo black and white, you can compare the two side by side and check your values. That's something that can be really handy, and at that stage, if you do it throughout the drawing process, and you notice that your artwork is not as dark or your highlights are not as bright as they should be compared to the reference photo, you can make those changes much more easy at that time. Now when you are working on areas like this where you've got nice fine detail, it really does make a difference to hold and use the pencil in a specific way to get the desired effect that you are after. How much pressure you put on that pencil, where you hold that pencil, and how your hand travels to move that pencil will all make such a difference in achieving the exact fur stroke and the fur type that you are after. It's something that I talk quite in depth, very in depth in fact, in my Patreon videos, because for me I think it's something that's really important and can make such a difference to the level of realism that we're able to get in our portraits. One of the questions that I'm frequently asked is how I'm able to get my details really soft when using the pastel pencils, especially when I'm using a textured paper like Pastelmat, and I do believe that it is all through how I hold the pencil, so it's something that I cover so much in depth with in every single video on Patreon. It's a lot more easier to explain when I'm holding that pencil in real time, so that you can clearly see how I'm moving that pencil to achieve that specific fur stroke. Now there is one other thing that I do strongly believe can affect how soft your details can be, and that is the layering process. How you are applying those layers and the order of those layers makes such a difference to how soft you can get your details on these finer detailed layers that I'm applying here. Now you'll see that I'll save my Carbothello white till the very end to make sure that I go as bright as I need to at that final stage. My brightest white I found is the Caran Chinese white, but I will only save that for the brightest, whitest parts of the portrait. Now on Jake here, that would be his muzzle area, so I didn't use that Chinese white on the ears at all, because I knew that I needed to go more brighter in that white value on other areas of the portrait. So that's something always to bear in mind, and know how light you're going to have to go, because we need to make sure that we have that variation between the highlights, same with the shadows, to make sure that we get that level of contrast that we're after. If I was to have used that Chinese white on the ear as well, I would be making the highlights in this ear as bright as the muzzle area, which wouldn't give the overall balance of this portrait and that lighting correct. So it's something to pay really close attention to in your reference photo. So these details that I'm adding over the top of the background here are subtle, but they are really important. These details that overlap that background are deliberate to make sure that our portrait and our subject does not look like a sticker that's just been stuck on top of that background. And here is the finished portrait of Jake. I loved every part of this portrait, the expression, his colouring, the lighting, adding all that detail, being that it was that much bigger. The 16 by 24 inches really does allow you that extra space to take it to the very next level. And I hope this video here on how I did his ear was useful. If it was, I'd really appreciate it if you could give the video a thumbs up, it really does help. And if you'd like to get notified of future content, hit the subscribe and the bell button, and then you'll get a little notification of when I upload future content. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll be uploading another video very soon.